Okay, so my turn in the barrel, following court, we did apparently a 5-minute deal. I don't even remember that.
That's after ag forestry, but it's
Yeah,
5 minutes.
okay, yeah. And then Jim did a longer one that I actually remember parts of and got something out of that one, so I'm gonna try to be somewhere in the middle here. I spent quite a bit of time going through the triangles instruction sheet and trying to fit as many things as I possibly could. I'm envious of Jim and Port's storytelling abilities. I gotta have a little more of a script for that fall apart. So storytelling, they say, is foundational in the way humans understand and connect to the past and have a vision for the future. So I'm gonna try to touch on that. It's also a form of resistance that groups like small forest landowners use to handle problems that they've been having. So personal and professional story, I'll do a little bit of both. Second page, one instruction that caught my eye was to, you have a beginning, middle, and end, but mainly the most important thing. So the most important thing that I'm going to try to convey as part of our story is that we care and we matter. And per our draft group agreement that we worked out there, I'm going to intend to be respectful and direct. So why does Ken care? I set choker behind a cat and an arch summer breaks during college. That was my first taste. I spent 35 years career in sales and marketing of a variety of wood products. Over the years, I was sales manager for Style and Rail solid wood door plant in Tacoma. Several different plywood plants, including a sanded fir plywood plant here in Olympia that I think was located around the farmers market somewhere. It was on water. Hardwood plywood plant, fir and southern yellow pine sheeting mills, several stud mills, Washington, Montana, Canada, Maine, sawmills in Tacoma, Klickitat, Libby, Montana, multiple species, South Dakota, and 3 mills in South Georgia. I was on a design team for new mills. So I was generally an okay salesman. I was a better manager, and I was even a better problem solver. Obviously not executive material. I became a true believer in wood in all of that process and the multiple benefits of wood products versus steel, concrete, plastic, and the environmental benefits of keeping more forest land forested. During the spotted owls days, I helped make and distribute thousands of these from Libby, Montana. This family supported by timber dollars. I even made one of my daughters put one of these signs up in her dorm room that said, "This student supported." I'm pretty sure it was only up when we visited. We bought a 30-acre clear cut in 1989. We planted 16,000 seedlings ourselves, my wife and son and I. I started my writing letters to editors and to Congress in the 90s. And then I mentioned earlier, I enrolled in the Ag Forestry Leadership Program in 2000, class 22. I'm a flawed messenger, but an advocate for all things related to multiple use forestry and those similar minded organizational goals. So I kind of resemble the organizations that wood is good. That's my name, and especially Cougars. I just got this.
Okay, are you done now?
Obviously, Washington Farm Forestry Association, and our motto is stewards of the land. And that's probably more important than even the money that we get out, being good stewards of the land. It's intrinsic in our soul and our being, and also for generations to come, especially when you get older. And also certified tree farm. If you've been to our annual meeting last week, you realize, we're all about not just wood production, water, wildlife, recreation, and family forest lands. So I've been worried about doing this presentation ever since I signed up for it. They've been kind of looking for clues. And one of our speakers at the awards banquet that we had Monday, 2 Mondays ago, was Vicki Christensen, who used to be Forest Practice Board Chair, and more recently the retired Chief of the U.S. Forest Service. So that was a special honor. One of the things I picked up from her talk was people don't care about what you know until they know that you care. So that's what I'm going to try to get. Again, if you haven't been there, there was 2 nominees for the National Tree Farmer of the Year award, both extremely special in their own and different, and which is the way of our word, way of our community. Since 1976, this state's actually had 3 national outstanding tree farmers of the year. So we've got a really strong program here in this state. So before my involvement, and I'm going to piggyback on Jim here a little bit, because I don't know if he's got it with him today or not, but he carries around the Timber, Fish, and Wildlife pocket version of the 1987. I don't have one of those, but I printed out the whole thing. And I want to point out that WFFA did step up in those days. I think there was 4 or 5 of them, all volunteer folks, and spent a lot of time in meetings. We got some agreements, we thought, and I'll just kind of touch on some of those. So every one of you, your organizations, were represented there except perhaps the counties. I couldn't find a representative on counties. I know Jim talked about being involved in those. This was all before my time, but
I'm getting a TFW.
Yeah.
County.
But I want to point out that everybody else at this table was represented in those discussions. They did include a small harvest exemption. And I was touched by Tom O'Brien at our last the little outing at Court's place, and we did this little role play thing. He asked a very genuine question about, it sounds like the landowners think or have some other obligation that was the commitments that were promised to them. I forget how you worded it. Hell, a lot better than I just did. But I was really struck by that question, and so I wanted to kind of touch on some of that. And within this small harvest exemption for small landowners in 1987, that all of the caucuses agreed to was if we got less than the 30-acre harvest, we had to leave 50% of the standard riparian leaf tree requirement. Of course, the rules have changed since that time, but it does help explain why our caucus, when it came to the 1999 legislation, we were kind of okay with some general language because we trusted all of the stakeholders in the group and knew where they were coming from. Similarly, when this document talks about impacts, it had one small paragraph. It says, in the area of timber harvesting impacts, the small landowners by definition are not a significant factor because their ownerships are dispersed and their cutting patterns are largely random. And there was a small harvest exemption in for each side. Also, the note I picked up there was quite an effort then and also in several places pushing the for intensive monitoring of not only what the small landowners are doing, but everywhere. It was 36 years ago, and we're now starting, at least on the small landowner side, we're at least talking about it in the experimental. That'd be a big part of whatever comes out of that. And of course, we had the ground rules that we touched about a little bit. It was just an earlier version of what we're doing. So again, that was all before my time. So when I first got started officially in TFW policy, and I was scrounging around looking for, things I can talk about appropriate here. I thought, hey, I've already done this. And I did it, essentially part of this in January of 2017. I thought initially, well, everybody's heard all this before, but no, they haven't. We're changing chairs here so fast. I'm guessing that the majority of folks haven't heard this, and I'm not going to go through the whole thing. It was a lot of it was a pitch for our template that sank last fall, but I will touch on some of the comments that I think are appropriate to telling our particular story. Our support of Forest and Fish in 1999 was contingent on general language commitments made to us. Our leadership support for Forest and Fish cost WFFA 30% of our membership because they believed we were unjustly giving up property rights, when our leadership was confident that Forest and Fish still protected small forest landowners just in alternative ways in the RCWs. I do believe there was good intentions by other stakeholders wanting to help achieve meaningful templates, but it seems the disconnect is essentially there's just no institutional memory from 1987 and 1999 agreements, my opinion. That was true in 2017 and still today. And then I had a list here to better understand the small forest landowners were in 2017. So with a quick review of our prior efforts to achieve the RCW requirements, utilizing just the goodwill of Forest and Fish stakeholders without benefit of science. We had a farm plan that was shepherded by Sherry Fox and Steve Bernath, a simple 2-pager. A 15-year permit was the only surviving bullet out of that farm plan, and that got through. The overstock stand template, it was actually created by a subcommittee of this group that did get through the finish line. The exempt 20-acre rule changes. We made several attempts in the legislature to change the 20-acre parcel to a 20-acre harvest unit. We would have been cool with that. We did get quite a bit of legislative support, but it was easily killed by other stakeholders. The fixed width buffer template, simplicity and parity with industry, successful and frequently used. Thanks, Adrian Miller actually shepherded that through the process. It really dealt with the simplicity because a lot of small landowners were leaving even more trees than what the rules, because they didn't understand that you have to see all that complicated stuff. We spent a couple of years on a draft East Side Forest Health template that helped define imminent mortality that we're now brought forward again in another process. We got real close, but it got so process heavy that the small forest landowners gave it up. It has to be obvious to all that the East Side forests need more, not less. Just not economical to do alternate plans. We're hoping that new changes that we're making, plus the support from the small landowner office, will kind of help fix that. There was a draft conifer restoration template. In fact, there was 3 of them that all failed. Couldn't get them across the finish line. Plenty of blame to go around, including on myself. Maybe this 4th experimental one that we're working on might get across the finish line. There was also a draft low impact template, mostly based on the current 500-foot hardwood conversion methods. Non-consensus, rushed, no traction beyond the small forest landowner advisory committee. And then the draft state caucus RMZ thinning template that was put to the forest practice board. Well intended, not collaborative. Eligibility improvements, thinning metrics were more restrictive than existing rules. Ended up with a food fight to a draw in front of the forest practice board and soured all participants. So our takeaways at this point, after all those efforts, was the landowners in the Small Forest Landowner Advisory Committee gave up on all future template efforts. Small forest landowners felt they were treated like special needs topics, charity, not a right, not full partners in forest and fish. The settlement agreement then took care of that part eventually. Small forest landowners feel disrespected and unappreciated. Yet I personally know that you, people in the room at that time and even today, have intended, personally know that you have intended these feelings, not intended those feelings. They're just the natural result of several years of not achieving the promises of forest and fish that we supported in good faith. The delegation of small forest landowners actually came to a TFW policy hat in hand, begging for help and advice on how to achieve the promises of forest and fish. Go find new friends. This body will not help you. That was the only response we got. How prophetic was that? During these years, the small forest landowner community provided thousands of selfless volunteer hours and uncompensated personal expenses for essentially no meaningful movement towards alternate harvest restrictions on smaller harvest units that may have a relatively low impact on aquatic resources. I've heard most of you acknowledge that small forest landowners were in fact tossed under the bus in the forest and fish, and you have expressed genuine desires to help. Thank you all for that. We know we're doing good work benefiting society, critters, air, water, but not feeling the societal love. We felt a sense of despair, resignation to the inevitable conversion of our lands over time, starting to look more seriously at options outside of the adaptive management. I know all of this sounds like whining, but that's our trail of tears. Not even close to that suffered by our tribal folks, but to those of us who have personally given so much feels comparable. And those were our feelings in 2017. Many of those feelings are even stronger today. There was a note in that report that Dick Miller, who was the SEMA rep, became our policy rep. He was a scientist and was totally convinced that the forest and fish commitments to small animals could be achieved by utilizing the best available science in our harvest restriction prescriptions. He believed strongly that 95% of the adaptive management program decisions were directed by good science, and maybe 5% policy and negotiation. That was the reverse of what he believed upon his retirement. His faith in science and the adaptive management program was broken. I have a bunch of stuff in here about the template. Then some common interests. I actually testified about this at one of the forest practice board meetings. Common interests. We are here for our constituents, the efforts, interests, but we're also here because we believe we matter to each one of you. We're joined at the hip with the industry on many issues. We rely on their expertise, counsel, markets, and infrastructure they help create that benefit our survival. We live in the counties who benefit from our taxes, whose citizens benefit from our scenic viewscapes, recreational opportunities, and jobs. We're part of what draws new county visitors and residents Department of Ecology, Fish and Wildlife, DNR, and the federal services all depend on small forest landowners sticking around to be able to fulfill your mandates to land stewardship, clean air, clean water, and critter habitat. We're about half of the private forest land in Washington. We strongly believe we are the preferred land use for the environment. The future of Washington's natural resources requires we work together in win-win relationships. Although it's not obvious, we have a unique commonalities with the tribal folks. We love the land and critters in our care. We like to hunt and fish. We value stewardship, conservation, and legacies for generations to come. We are zealous about protecting our rights. And we really don't like being told what we can or can't do. We came to the table to help salmon. We're offended by assertions otherwise. Of all the common interests, I believe the vast majority of small forest landowners are more aligned with those of the greater environmental community. The focus of our annual chapter meeting at my place, in fact, is going to be a bird walk. So not forestry stuff. Economics almost always rises to the top of our list for short periods, only to fall back in priority for the majority of our stewardship time. We own and work forest land primarily because we have an affinity with the forest, the plants, and all the dependent critters. It's an emotional connection with our small part of the earth. So after many years of working to actually realize the small forest landowner promise of forest fish, we really don't feel on the top of the pedestals our common interests would seem to dictate. We do want to be your friends. So that was kind of what I had given in 2017, kind of fit the scenario. Obviously, I'm not going to go into the template, but this was one piece of a stack of papers at least that high that we worked on for 9 years. We poured our heart and soul into the last template effort. We failed to convince most of you that our proposal was supported by the RCWs and the WACs, supported by the science, or supported by all of our predecessors. In our eyes, a total failure of TFW policy, 1987 and 1999. We, and some of you, visited the Hama Hama Tree Farm last week at our annual meeting that celebrated WFFA's 70th anniversary as a registered organization. An organization actually started by agency foresters, by the way. How far out have we come? What we learned and saw was amazing. From 32-year-old redwood that is just as impressive as the adjacent old growth standard Doug fir to a dead and dying riparian zone that can't be managed under the current rules. To a story of a 25-year relationship with long-lived kings that spoke to the fact that forestry is not the problem for salmon. Far from it. And it probably never was. If you look back through the arc of history, as Dave Robbins shared with us in a video and a letter that I'll share with you all later via email. It is beneficial to have a long history with the land, for you can see the impacts of all your decisions, good and bad. And also see the fallacy of some of the external opinions that are thrust upon you by those who feel that forest management is somehow bad. It's not. Our sentiment and experience is that it's good for the fish and water and the climate, but in today's regulatory climate, maybe not for the landowner. You see that 18 acres of old growth that some of you saw is kept by the Hama Hama family for sentimental reasons, has the potential to eliminate the viability of the family farm. Why? Because under the current rules of a critter Merlet, owl, eagle, something, moves in, then the limits on the harvest around it severely compromise the ability of the farm to sustain its family members, as they have been doing since 1890. Let that sink in. The perverse, unintended consequences of rules that provide more and more limits with fewer and fewer benefits means that families are faced with tough decisions that don't help the critters. Stewards of the land is a high priority for all of us, but we are stewards of our family first. What would change the trajectory? Obviously, more true collaboration. It helps that we have a seat at the table now, but it doesn't help that we can't move past the bureaucracy and into real solutions that meet the needs of critters and the family. We need an outcome-based paradigm. Most of you consider yourselves as white hats, good guys. With a few exceptions, most of our peers consider you as black hats because of bureaucracy that you're dealt with, not because of you as individuals. I don't yet subscribe to the ill intent seen by most of our peers, perhaps because I've gotten to know you. Forest landowners are necessarily optimistic about the future, despite what feels like no good deed should go unpunished. Couple more recent examples for despair. Last year, I attended a meeting of the Center for Responsible Forestry, just to see what that was all about. Very professional, very well-intended folks, very powerful. But their mission was no touch. No, don't cut any trees down. It was the spotted owl days all over. Nobody realized that 53% of our 22 million acres of Washington forest land are already permanently set aside. It was like the world was falling apart if we don't save some more trees. But they were well intended. We talked to some of the folks here. Their motivation was we like big trees. That is as far as it went. I don't think anybody realized, in my opinion, the harm that they were about to do. Then last week, I got a letter from Thurston County Planning. They eyeballed my two largest parcels, and they want to change the zoning on that from designated forest land to long-term ag. And by the way, remove 2/3 of my development rights in the process. Bonnie woke up the other day and says, "You've got to quit fooling around with this other stuff and get into Olympia and get this subdivided into 5 acres right now." She was adamant. She doesn't get adamant very often. The point of those two examples is emotionally, it's really hard for me to maintain hope when it feels like all is lost. What the hell is the point? I personally believe there's always some good and bad. Some recent examples after the template failure. It's been really good collaboration on the special small forest landowner alternate plan guidance. That's been just wonderful. DNR's leadership on the 75-foot prescriptions. The state agency forest practice board member suggestion, just after they voted our template down, was that we go to the legislature and ask for 100% threat payments rather than the 50 to 94% on a complex sliding scale. And DNR, WDFW, and DOE all came and testified in support. That was really, really cool. We're going to keep that alive for next year, and we hope we have more of you testifying in support. If we're successful, that'll take all the wind out of our sails. Most of it. So I'm going to skip this part in the interest of time. But our failures have been because we can't find that northeast deal with this interest-based stuff. And for landowners, there just is no option. But science is gonna give us an option, because the science is saying that we don't need the big buffers that we've got for large woody debris. And that's getting clearer and clearer. That would give us some leverage to do other things that we want to do. That's my new mantra, and we're gonna hear a lot more about that going forward. So I'll skip that. Other than we need a changed paradigm. I'll read one line of my pitch. It would create a shift within the adaptive management program, a tree budget, if you will, that eliminates winners and losers while reestablishing the paradigm of TFW trust, knowing that the regulatory changes must be win-win for both the landowners and RMZ functionality. So I'll close with a poem that some of you have heard before, but it's a poem that resonates personally with me and at several levels. It also touches, if you want to understand small landowners, it touches on most of the things that's in small forest landowner hearts and minds. The title of the poem is When You Are So Old by Robert Neal. My friends quite often ask of me, why does an old man plant a tree? It grows so slow it will not pay a profit for you anyway. Then why in storm and winter cold do you plant when you're so old? Answers seem hard to define when muscles ache and they are mine. But I just cannot stand to see a space where there should be a tree. So that in part as years unfold is why I plant when I'm so old. I know that animals, bugs, and things love trees, and so do such as go on wings. So creatures wild that benefit is one more reason I can't quit from planting trees while I can hold by planting hold, though I'm so old. They say that those retired from labor should fish and play and talk to neighbors. They also say that folks in leisure should do the things that give them pleasure. And so the thought on which I'm sold, I'll plant some trees, though I'm so old. As time goes on, my trees will grow, so tall and clean and row on row. The furry folk will have a home. The birds can nest and kids can roam. All of this, as I've told, because I planted trees, though I'm so old. And then there's my family, young folks who will follow me. I'd like to leave them with some land, stocked with trees and looking grand. These gifts I value more than gold. So I plant some trees, though I'm so old. And taxes too, for schools and roads, good jobs and lumber for abodes. I won't see these things. I won't be there. But in my mind, it's clear. The words of some who could be told might thank a man who is so old. Excuse me. Man should be proud of what's his own and how he's managed what he's grown. But management must be begun by planting seedlings one by one. And so my pride I will uphold. I'll plant some trees, though I'm so old. So when my friends ask of me, why does an old man plant a tree? Perhaps the lines above explain how aching back and limbs in pain may by commitment be controlled to plant some trees, though I'm so old. Thank you all for listening. We do care. Happy to take any questions or talk about some of this individually later with anybody. That's our story. That's my story. Thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you, Ted.
Thanks, Ken.